Imagine a world where you can have your cake and actually eat it too, without the sugar crash, the guilt, or the health concerns. Well, there's been a lot of buzz about this rare sugar called allulose, and the initial research is saying that allulose can not only help reduce insulin resistance, but also curb hunger, boost the body's own GLP-1 secretions, improve the gut microbiome, and actually reduce blood sugar. Now, the studies are preliminary, but they're very promising and certainly worth talking about. So this video is all about allulose. Now, we have a big problem, not only just here in the USA, but also globally. Metabolic dysfunction, characterized by insulin resistance, poor glucose and lipid metabolism, chronic inflammation. It's a rising global crisis right now. It's fueling diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, hypertension. Now, this chart only goes back to 1990, but the problem worsens the further back we look. Now, the solution is complex, right? But it usually starts with reducing the amount of sugars and carbohydrates that we consume. And it's no secret that our society consumes excess amounts of carbohydrates and sugars, which has fueled this chronic disease epidemic. Now, the simple solution would be to cut back on sweets. But we have a society that has this sweetness addiction, and I wish that that would stop, but it's unlikely to. So as a result, the world has turned to artificial sweeteners, right? Or what is known as non-nutritive sweeteners or low-calorie sweeteners. And unfortunately, they have their own problems, including increased cardiovascular disease risk, increased type 2 diabetes risk, weight gain, anxiety, and mood disorders. So just very quickly, let's look at each one of these conditions and their association with artificial sweeteners, starting with cardiovascular disease. Now, this study looked at 12 other studies, including over 1.2 million people, and they concluded significant association between high consumption of artificially sweetened beverage and increased incidence of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and stroke, highlighting the potential long-term cardiovascular implications. Now, they say high consumption, but the reality is what they're talking about is just one serving per day increases the risk, right? So artificial sweeteners are also linked with higher rates of type 2 diabetes in a dose-dependent fashion, meaning the more you have, the more likely you are to have type 2 diabetes. This paper looked at 34 other studies and concluded that with each additional sugar-sweetened beverage per day, the risk of developing diabetes increased by 27%. But if you substituted sugar for artificial sweetener, the risk still went up by 13% per serving of artificial sweeteners. So if we project that out in a graph, it would look like this. So clearly, the consumption of artificial sweeteners still increases the risk of diabetes and insulin resistance, albeit not as much as sugar. Now next, we can look at obesity, right? This 2017 study followed 10,000 adolescents for 5 years and found that the use of artificial sweeteners was associated with a 70% increase in the risk of obesity. They said, low-calorie sweet consumption is associated with increased odds of obesity among adolescents. This relationship is strikingly independent of total energy intake. Now lastly, let's look at anxiety and mood disorders. And this particular paper that we're going to look at looked at aspartame. Now aspartame is found in over 5,000 different foods and diet drinks, including Diet Coke, Sprite Zero, Crystal Light, and many others. Now what this study did is they took mice and they gave them less than 15% of the maximum RDA dose per day, the equivalent for humans of about 2 to 4 Coke per day. And not only did it produce anxiety-like behavior in those mice, but even in their offspring who weren't given aspartame. But it didn't stop there. Even their grandchildren displayed this behavior. So mice given aspartame developed anxiety-like behavior for 2 generations. So obviously we can't, study a transgenerational effect of aspartame on humans, but what we do know is that aspartame does increase the risk of anxiety in humans who consume more aspartame. So I think I've set the table here. We have a global crisis, a national explosion of metabolic dysfunction, which includes obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and a lot of it is driven by these addictions to carbohydrates and sugar, right? Now, the simple solution is to reduce sugar consumption. But instead, the world has turned to artificial sweeteners. However, artificial sweeteners have been linked directly to an increase in cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, anxiety, and mood disorders, right? Now, I'm not going to lecture you about eating sweet foods. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you know that I certainly would recommend trying to get rid of your sweet tooth. However, I'm also a realist, and I know it's difficult for many people. That's why I want to talk to you about allulose, this rare sugar that's just showing so much promise. Now, allulose is a rare sugar that's found in figs and raisins and maple syrup and molasses. And we're going to go on a bit of a journey with allulose, but we're going to start at the end and work our way back. So first of all, unlike other artificial sweeteners that we've talked about that have been linked to weight gain and an increased risk of insulin resistance and diabetes, allulose does the opposite. Allulose seems to actually lead to weight loss, reductions in blood sugar levels, improvements in insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes as measured by the HOMA-IR, and improvements in the gut microbiome. So initially, let's look at studies that are done in mice, since that's where most studies start, and then we'll get to the human studies. So let's start with this study. In this study, mice were fed a standard diet or a Western diet. Now, the Western diet had a lot of fat and sugar in it, right? And they subdivided these two groups further by feeding some of them drinking water flavored with stevia or allulose. Over a 12-week time frame, you can see that the mice who were given allulose, they gained less weight than the mice given stevia. Why is that, you ask? Well, they consumed less food because they were less hungry. And as we'll see, they were less hungry because allulose stimulates GLP-1 secretions in the body. Now, at this point, it's probably important to understand a little bit about GLP-1 and GIP. Now, what happens when you eat a meal is that the trillions of bacteria in the gut, called the gut microbiome, digest our food and they produce short-chain fatty acids. Now, these short-chain fatty acids act on the K cells and L cells in the gut lining, and they produce two hormones called incretin hormones. They're called GLP-1 and GIP. Now, I know most of you have probably heard of Ozempic and Wegovy. These are very common weight loss drugs these days, and some of you may know that they facilitate the action of GLP-1. Now, by doing so, they improve glucose metabolism, increase satiety, which is your sense of feeling full, and so you tend to eat less. Well, going back to our mouse study, you may wonder why the mice who were fed allulose alone not only gained less weight, but also ate less. And the answer may be because they produced a lot more GLP-1. And by increasing GLP-1, they also did not see an increase in insulin and blood sugar that the stevia group did. But also over 12 weeks, the group on the Western diet plus stevia saw a worsening of their HOMA-IR, while the allulose group did not. Now, if you've watched some of my previous videos, you'll know that HOMA-IR is one of the best predictors we have for insulin resistance. Okay, so just in this one study, we can see that using allulose can increase the GLP-1 secretions by the body, thereby reducing food consumption, improving insulin and blood sugar levels, the HOMA-IR, and weight gain compared to stevia. But that's just one study. So let's look at another study in mice that had similar design protocol published in the prestigious journal Nature. They started out by saying, overeating and arrhythmic feeding promote obesity and diabetes. GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic and Wegovy are effective anti-obesity drugs, but their use is limited by side effects. Here, we show that oral administration of the non-calorie sweetener rare sugar D-allulose induces GLP-1 release, activates vagal afferent signaling, reduces food intake, and promotes glucose tolerance in healthy and obese diabetic animal models. Now, what they found in this study is that allulose reduces hunger in a dose-dependent manner. So you can see at the top here, the mice were given either saline, 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight of allulose, 1 gram of allulose per kilogram of body weight, 3 grams of allulose per kilogram of body weight. Accordingly, there was less food consumption with higher doses of allulose. Now, why would that happen? Well, again, we can see that GLP-1 response was markedly higher in the allulose versus saline group or glucose groups, again, in a dose-dependent manner. The more allulose given resulted in more GLP-1. Now, we could continue on with many more studies on mice, but you're probably wondering, what about humans? Do studies on humans show the same thing? Well, here's a paper on humans who were given allulose versus placebo drinks for 12 weeks. In the end, they concluded comparison of the body composition related markers before and after revealed that body weight, BMI, body fat percentage, and body fat mass were significantly decreased following allulose supplementation. Now, also in the study, they did find that HOMA-IR was reduced in the group given allulose versus placebo, but it didn't reach statistical significance. Now, here's another study on humans where they compared the response of sucrose, or in other words, table sugar, versus allulose. And they looked at glucose and insulin responses over a 2-hour time frame when they were given drinks containing 15 grams of allulose, 15 grams of allulose plus 30 grams of sucrose, or just 30 grams of sucrose, like table sugar. Now, when these subjects were given just allulose, it actually dropped their insulin and blood sugar levels. When they were given allulose with sugar, the allulose was able to lower the insulin and blood sugar responses to the normal sugar. So really, this means that people taking allulose with no other sugar not only don't get the normal rise in blood sugar that you do with regular sugar or very often with artificial sugars, but allulose can actually lower your blood sugar and insulin. And if this holds up in other studies, that would be incredible. But we can go on with other individual studies, but as usual, we could just turn to a meta-analysis where one study takes the data from a whole bunch of other studies that have been done and puts it together. Now, this study did exactly that. It looked at 8 other studies that have been done on allulose in humans and found that allulose attenuates postprandial, in other words, after you eat. Allulose attenuates postprandial blood glucose concentrations in healthy humans. As a result, allulose is a valuable blood glucose management tool for healthy humans and diabetic patients. Now again, you may be wondering how allulose can do all that, right? Well, if we go back to this graph and work backwards from the weight loss, we can go all the way back to the idea that short-chain fatty acids are what stimulate the intestinal cells to make GLP-1 and GIP. So is that how allulose works? Well, it seems so. This paper specifically found that when mice are given a normal diet versus a high-fat diet versus erythritol versus allulose, the allulose induces a significant increase in short-chain fatty acids. And the same authors in another paper found that in these mice, allulose increased beneficial bacteria that are associated with good digestive health, immune function, and the production of short-chain fatty acids. Sucralose, on the other hand, has been shown to increase bacteria that are associated with dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is like an unhealthy gut microbiome, characterized by an increase in firmicutes, proteobacteria, and a decrease in beneficial bacteria like Akkermansia. Now, these changes have been linked to impaired blood sugar control and insulin resistance and metabolic disturbances. So if we work backwards from the weight loss aspects, allulose has been shown to help with weight loss in humans and mice. It's been shown to help with blood sugar management in humans and mice. It's been shown to increase GLP-1 production in humans and mice. It's been shown to increase short-chain fatty acids in mice, but there hasn't been any human studies that have shown that yet. And it's been shown to improve the composition in the gut microbiome in mice, but not in human studies yet. In addition to blood sugar management in humans, which might lead to better weight loss, allulose has also been shown to increase fat oxidation in humans. Now, this paper concluded at a low dose, allulose enhances postprandial, and again that means after you eat, fat oxidation and decreased carbohydrate oxidation in healthy humans. This indicates that allulose has the potential to be an anti-obese sweetener in humans. So, with all that said, let's tap the brakes for a second. We need to understand that this concept of allulose is still relatively new, and we've been falsely confident in other sweeteners in the past, right, that end up having significant health effects, negative health effects. So while the studies on allulose thus far are certainly interesting and optimistic, we don't have a lot of long-term data yet, and although there is a number of studies that tout the safety of allulose based on what we know so far, like the only negative side effects seem to be gastrointestinal related, mainly that high doses of allulose can cause diarrhea. So here's a chart, and you can screenshot this if you want, that outlines the dosing that humans seem to tolerate before you seem to be running to the bathroom. So in the end, allulose certainly seems to be the safer sweetener out there. Not only is it appearing to be neutral for blood sugar management, but it actually seems beneficial for lowering blood sugar increasing insulin sensitivity, in other words, reducing insulin resistance, and improving the HOMA-IR, which is one of the best indicators of insulin resistance in diabetes. So, as always, do your own research and approach things cautiously. And lastly, if you're looking for allulose, there is a company out there with a great team of researchers that have been developing a product called RX Sugar. Their products are all flavored with allulose, and no, I don't have any connection or affiliate links to that company. I'm just spreading that word. So let me know what you think in the comments below about allulose.